Marko Papic has seen many places in this world, and he spends his time analyzing how what happens in one place of the world can impact people, policies, finances, and the future in others. Hi, I'm Dave Price. Marko is a well-known geopolitical expert. His experiences, education, and intuition guide him. He was born in Belgrade, Serbia. Since then, he's also lived in Iraq, Jordan, Switzerland, Canada, and now the United States. Marko is a macro and geopolitical expert at BCA Research, a global investment research firm. He's also the author of a book. It's called Geopolitical Alpha, an investment framework for predicting the future. All right, so that's his resume. Now, in our conversation this week, he will talk about tariffs, global policy, immigration, agriculture, and a few other things too. But first, we like to get to know our guests a bit before we find out what they know. So I wanted to start off with how Marko copes with so much time on the road. Well, we appreciate the time. Thanks for joining us. I think since this is your first time joining us on the podcast, I always like to talk to the guests a little bit. The one thing, I have a million things to ask you about, but you travel so extensively, and I'm curious how you do it. For those of us who've been on maybe an international vacation, you come back all screwed up, out of whack, all those kind of things. And I always look at people like you and wonder how you balance it all and where you're not just fried when you get home. So how do you do it?
Well, I'm not prepared for this, Dave. You're putting me on a spot.
That's the plan.
I'll give you my dad advice,
Okay.
It's silly. I just want to preempt it that way. It's my 3 W's
Okay.
of travel. It's water. You got to drink water, and that means you got to not drink alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
The second is you got to work out. It doesn't have to be intense, but you got to move. And the final one, and this is the most important one, is you got to work. And obviously, when you go on the road for a job, you may be excused if you think you're already working, but you're not, because those emails, those reports, that reading, you got to do anyways. It's not going to read itself. It's not going to write itself. Emails are not going to answer themselves. And so this is why I always tell the young strategists in my industry, when you're on the road to see clients, the business class flight for 12 hours, it's not there for you to enjoy like 3 movies. It's called business class for a reason. You got to work that 8-10 hours. So those would be my tips.
And you have 3 super important reasons not to be worn out when you get home and to be productive while you're on the road, right?
That's right. I have 3 kids, going on 17, going on 13, going on 8. So very different ages, and so different problems. You can't just like group it. I don't have any scalability. It's like 3 different sets of things. You got to dedicate
stages of life, right?
Yeah, you can't just just group them together and be like, okay, you two, you really need to like work, on your grades. No. It's all like there's boyfriends, there's like puberty issues, there's like nobody pays attention to me because I'm a 7-year-old third.
Right. And if you can deal with that, then clearly you can follow international politics right now, right?
It's kind of like that. I'm not gonna lie. There is a lot of moving parts, and my career, my profession, I kind of designed myself. People don't teach you how to do this in school,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really to be like a politics and geopolitics whisperer for investors. So on one hand, you got to follow the politics and the geopolitics, but on the other hand, you got to translate it into what does it mean for a 10-year treasury yield, for the currency, for equities, and so on. So yes, there's a lot of moving parts.
So
And
why
kids
this?
keep you on
How'd
your
you get
toes.
into this?
I fell backwards into it. I didn't get pushed forwards. I kind of fell backwards. And what that means is I tried to be an academic. So I was doing a PhD at the University of Texas and wasn't really good at being an academic.
Hmm.
Spending, anywhere between 6 and 36 months on answering one question. And I respect a lot of people who do that, and they are brilliant and they're really smart, and you got to go to them when you want to know something fundamental. And I do. I mean, I read books, like I read their academic papers, but me being a producer of that kind of work wasn't for me. So I quit my PhD program midway and I went to the private sector, and then I did political risk consulting for about 5 years and didn't like that either. I felt that that industry is full of people who don't make real forecasts. They effectively just produce, this kind of like, oh, political volatility in Turkey will go up. And then, everything from a coup d'etat to like the deputy finance minister resigning is the same. Like I got it right. Well, those two are pretty different. And I think the reason that finance really fits me is because I'm a very competitive person. And that doesn't mean I need to win all the time. I just want to know if I won. I want to know. And so what I like about finance is there's a scoreboard, and it's a daily, hourly, minute by minute scoreboard. You either made the right call or you didn't. And so that was my third career choice. I only found it at 29, by the way. And so I had all this academic, practical experience of trying to make sense of politics and geopolitics. And then you would argue later in my life, I had to then learn finance really quickly. And I was very lucky to join a firm up in Canada called BCA Research with 76-year history of doing this kind of work. And I really trained up on how to incorporate macroeconomics and politics and geopolitics. So when I tell you something's going to happen politically, I really only use it as a tool to predict the markets. I don't have a horse in the race. I'm bathed in aloof indifference. I'm here just to try to get the markets right.
When you're out talking to international groups, how do you describe President Trump's views on foreign policy?
I don't think it's that hard. I don't think it's that difficult. I believe that the world is multipolar, which actually is very acceptable outside of the US. It's in the US that the audience usually has a problem with that definition. And usually because the reaction is either, no, we're still number one, or no, it's a two-horse race, us and China. And my controversial view, at least for Americans, is like it's a 12-horse race. And yes, the US is the number one horse, but may or may not win. It's more in doubt than it was in the 90s. So I start with that, and the international world, they've seen this in action. They've felt it. They've lived it. And so they're acceptable to it. And then my answer is, well, Donald Trump is a reaction to that. He's adjusting American foreign policy to the reality that the US is no longer either maintaining an empire, nor is it trying to impose one. He's now one of many. And when you are just one of many, the foreign policy gets a lot more Machiavellian, a lot more realist and pragmatist, less normative. And so I would argue that explanation actually, explains a lot for foreign audiences. And usually you get a lot of folks like nodding their head at that point.
So you don't see that what he's trying to do with tariffs, he's trying to establish himself as that top horse where everybody else is here?
No, I actually don't. Many countries have tariffs higher than the US.
Sure.
So that's the first. The second is that it's the actually opposite, I would argue. Every empire is built on sticks and carrots. Every empire. No empire is just sticks. It doesn't last long. So what was the carrot of American empire? How did America give something to the rest of the world? It was access to the American market. Unfettered access to the American market. That was the carrot. If you follow American rules and norms, you get a carrot. If you don't, you get bombed. But if you do follow American rules and norms, you get something in return. That was that access to the American market. And so when the empire is gone, or when the politicians in America and policymakers have decided, okay, well, we may still be the most powerful country in the world, which I do believe America still is just it doesn't run an empire. At that point, it's at that point that you say to yourself, well, why am I giving unfettered access, unregulated access, untaxed access to my market, to everybody else in the world? And I think that's where the tariffs come in. Now, there's ways to have tariffs be, onerous, and there's way to make tariffs relatively sane. And I think that in April and May of this year, we had a fight between two philosophies inside the White House. One is an isolationist, very much like, let's bring manufacturing back to America, even if it's manufacturing bananas. So that's not going to work.
It's tough to do in the Midwest.
It's tough to do. That's that 35-40% tariff rate that they did set on April 2nd, by the way. That's the Howard Lutnick approach. I would call it the neo-McKinleyist report approach. McKinley, of course, the president who really, really liked tariffs, that a lot of tariff proponents harken back to late 19th century when America financed the whole government with tariffs, even though the whole government was like 1% of GDP. But let's leave that aside. It was a very tiny government. And then there's the other approach, which I think Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is more enamored with, which is like, look, we do have some deficit problems. We had some debt problems. And yes, we're not an empire anymore. So let's start taxing some of these imports, not at onerous levels, not at levels where other countries are just going to stop dealing with us, but at a level that's, to an extent helps with deficits, helps with debt, and maybe helps create better trade deals that are more acceptable to our current standing in the world.
The one thing I did not understand with this, and you used the bananas example, why, and they've since adjusted coffee, bananas, some other things. Why was that so high to begin with? The whole concept of we don't want other countries to make stuff, we want to make stuff here on the most basic level. People can understand, okay, this is what he's going for here. Well, we can't just grow a bunch of bananas. I joke that we can't do it in the Midwest, but you can't. There's a lot of stuff we can't do here. We're not going to grow avocados here, whatever. Avocados, coffee, bananas, whatever. So why were those tariffs so high initially, and then they backed off later? What was the point of that?
Well, I'll tell you a little story. I mean, I've always had a view that President Trump has a certain negotiating style, and it's worked really well for me in the markets. Generally speaking, I tell my clients to cool it. Anytime he says something, like if he says, I want to go to the moon, and you got to pay for the staircase to the moon, you got to do that. He usually means like, bring a ladder, we'll go to the roof of the house, we'll have a beer up there. Like that's, but on April 2nd, I got to tell you, Dave, I, as probably Trump intended, I hesitated with that view. I was like, wait a minute, maybe he really got convinced. Yeah, maybe he got convinced that we should, like, Howard Lutnick once held a water bottle and said, why are we importing Fiji water? Well, snobs like me like water from the Pacific Islands, okay, Howard? No, on April 2nd, I got rattled a little bit, even though I had this very, very disciplined approach to trying to forecast President Trump's behavior. And it was so funny because when I talked to the head of sales of my unit, she told me, but don't you always say he negotiates? I was like, I don't know this time, though. And she goes to me like, yeah, but I do this all the time with your research. I set a price real high, and I was like, oh, well, let's not tell my clients that. Yeah. But the point is why? The answer is, I think that, Trump's brain works more like my head of sales, like her brain, than he works like mine. I probably would have gone in negotiations with some very complicated analysis of how much the other side owes me. And I would lead with that. The problem with leading with that, going to Germany and being like, well, my math says I should impose a 9% tariff on your goods, then they're going to be like, well, can it be 5? Whereas if you go there and you're like, you know what? I'm an idiot. I believe I can move all production into the Americas. Yes, Dave, even bananas. Mm-hmm. We'll grow them inside of, greenhouses. Well, you can't really do that. Well, I can. Then the whole world is like, oh my God, these guys don't know what they're doing. And then they don't lower the tariff to like 4. They lower it to that 9% price. So I do think that what you'll see throughout next 12 months is I think you'll see tariffs go even further down. So bananas are just the beginning. The tariff right now, the overall, if you were to put all the tariffs together, adjust them for the imports, it's 14.4%. I believe that we're going to settle over the course of the next 12 to 18 months around between 8 and 12%. So we're going to come down to that level. Now, that's still like 4 times higher than it was pre-Trump. But it's not at a level where this is really about moving production to the US. I really honestly think this is about, it's a new geopolitical tool because America no longer is running an empire. So now we're going to be a more discerning on who the friends are, and who gets access, who doesn't. But I think the biggest point here is that there's a huge deficit, there's a huge debt level, and someone's got to pay for it. And it is a consumption tax. Let's be very clear. The Trump administration, when they say it's not a consumption tax, I don't see how that's possible. It is a consumption tax. And unfortunately, America has to raise taxes. And how do you find a tax that politicians and voters want to raise? It's hard to find one. And so this is it.
And so we've done one big beautiful. Most folks got some kind of tax relief there. So we're just going to make up for everything on the consumption side.
Well, most folks didn't get any relief. So one big beautiful bill extends the tax relief
sure.
from 2017.
Sure.
The problem is extending it costs $4.5 trillion. And so the Republicans in the House of Representatives actually surprised, I think, President Trump of how conservative they were back in January, February, because they actually did put in some cuts into the one big beautiful bill, but not enough to pay for that 2017 tax extension. And so the tariffs I'm speaking about bring somewhere around $3 trillion over the next 10 years. So they don't pay for all of one big beautiful bill. The cuts pay for the rest. But yes, this is what calmed the bond market. And what I would say to you and people listening to this, America is at a point where it cannot stimulate the economy anymore. There cannot be fiscal stimulus. Why? Because the bond market is on thin ice. 10-year yield is at 4.1, 4.2%. It threatened to burst through 5% earlier in 2025. That was your warning by the bond market. Hey, don't mess around. And so without tariffs, I believe that without the tariff revenue, we would have had a fiscal crisis in this country. We would have the bond vigilantes. We would have had a sell-off of our bond market the way the United Kingdom experienced, the way that Japan is experiencing, the way that Italy and Spain experienced during the euro area crisis back in 2010s, if folks remember that. I think we were at a threshold of that. And without tariffs, that it is what it is. In other words, we're in this upside-down macro world where if you want to stimulate the economy, you got to lower borrowing rates. And that requires less fiscal profligacy. It requires discipline. And unfortunately, because Congress is so broken and Democrats and Republicans just disagree fundamentally on how to raise revenue or cut spending, the only thing that we can do is the President of the United States of America makes this executive decision to raise tariffs.
So what's the longer term impact of these continued higher tariffs? It's a consumption, as you said, so we're paying for it, right?
Absolutely. Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, the longer term impact is, tariffs are not good for the economy. Like that's just, and we're not going to return any manufacturing domestically. It's not going to happen. Why? Well, if we do, no one's going to work in those factories. So Howard Lutnick is wrong. So is Peter Navarro. So is everyone in that neo-McKinleyist camp. If you disagree with me, go on YouTube and type in China dark factory. Just type in China dark factory. And what's going to come up is a video of a factory inside of China that doesn't have light bulbs because humans don't work in it. So it's dark. All right, so that's where the world is going. So even if manufacturing comes back to the US, great, no one's going to work in those factories. So the neo-McKinleyist camp is wrong because it's not 1895. It's not even 1970, for God's sakes. So on that front, the tariffs just don't do what, this whole revival of manufacturing, it's just not going to happen. On the other hand, they're also bad because even if it revived manufacturing, it would be crappy manufacturing. It would be manufacturing that's not exposed to global competition. And, competition is what makes great productivity. It's having to fight with the Chinese and the Germans and the Japanese that creates a great car. Many countries have tried what's called import substitution model, where you raise tariffs so high that you substitute imports with domestic manufacturing. They've always failed. It never works. It leads to cars that nobody around the world wants to buy. Usually, the domestic manufacturers get lazy from a lack of competition. So, um, but that's not what we imposed. We imposed a smaller tariff. It's about 10, 12% in the long term. I think it's just going to curb American consumption a little bit and shift the GDP makeup away from consumption towards investment and actually towards exports as well, because I think the long-term implication here is that the currency is going to decline over the next 5 years, making American exports more competitive. Not because we're protecting domestic manufacturing, but because we effectively slowed down the pace of the economy over the next 5 years. 70% of American GDP is consumption, and this taxes that.
One of the things that I've not understood since Donald Trump came back to the office, to the White House, is when I go talk to groups, especially if it's primarily business leaders, they just keep coming back to the importance of certainty. Donald Trump comes from a business background, but he is anything but certainty, promoting certainty in the way he leads, in the way he governs. And I appreciate your analogy about negotiations, because that does seem to be what he does. You say this, and then you come down, and this doesn't feel so bad, right? But for the business community, where they have to make some kind of strategic plans, tariffs are this, so their costs are this, it can change. Tomorrow it could be this, and next week it could be this. It just feels like chaos. Now, you've said that when you talk to folks, you tell them to kind of chill, don't overreact. I mean, that's hard to do when you're doing medium and long-term planning, though, right?
Absolutely. No, when I say chill and relax, I really mean anyone who's a professional investor in securities. And that's borne fruit this year. I mean, the market is up. The April blip seems like so long ago, right?
For sure, for
The
sure.
correct move was to either do nothing or buy on the dip. So, but I agree with you. When you are thinking beyond the next quarter, which is what real business leaders do, they don't think like quarter to quarter. They think more, 5-year plans and so on. I agree with you. It's very difficult. And what I would say is that I think that President Trump took on immigration and trade first. And so, what I'm on trade, I think we're past peak uncertainty. And I think due to the polarizing nature of the tariffs, which are a consumption tax, there's no way to avoid that. Due to the polarizing nature, he's going to continue to suffer in the polls for that. Now, on one hand, I have sympathy for the White House. Like the bond market would have absolutely rioted to pay for the certainty of tax cuts, to pay for the certainty of the 2017 tax cuts. If you're a business leader and you like 2017 corporate tax rate, well, you got to pay for it. So the uncertainty of the trade policy had to happen in order to pay for the certainty of the tax. So there I have some sympathy for that. Where I don't really have sympathy is on the immigration front, where I think immigration is just as important for many business owners, particularly in the Midwest. And the problem there is that, yes, this is, the immigration policy right now is all about enforcement, but there's nothing about stability of supply. And that's where I do think that President Trump took on these two big uncertainty headwinds head on. I understand the trade one. He had to pay for the tax cuts. Fine. God bless you. You did it. Cool. Well done. I think Scott Bessent is going to continue to encourage him over the next 12 months to lower it from that 14.4% to 8 to 12. But on the immigration front, I just don't really see any solution to the uncertainty that they've taken a bite out of. There's no plan. There's just enforcement. And that doesn't solve America's needs, because the US still does need immigrants in various sectors, and it needs a comprehensive immigration reform. The problem with that, as you know, is that there was a way to raise revenue without Congress, which is the tariffs. There's a way to avoid the polarization of Democrats and Republicans, to kind of obviate it with, creative legislation. There is no way to pass a bill in Congress without at least 5 to 10 Democrats signing on in the Senate. And so that's where I don't see any real solution to the uncertainty on the immigration front.
So is his play with this strictly on the enforcement side to round up as many folks as he can, deport them, and by sort of threat of intimidation, get many others to leave voluntarily, get rid of as many people as possible, and then start over in deciding who can come into this country? Is that too sanitized?
No, I think that's what the goal is. I'm not sure that the goal is to evict everyone. I think that the sanitized, as you say, version of this, and I apologize for being inhumane, but my job is to be a nihilist. I'm an analyst, and what I would say is that the point of the brutality of the enforcement action is to ensure that nobody dares to come to America illegally, and that's been very successful. Like just from a numbers game, the number of people trying to cross into the U.S. illegally is down to zero. And why? Well, because the vast majority of people coming to America are looking for a better economic outcome. They're actually not fleeing war or persecution. So on the liberal side, there's this kind of myth that everyone's fleeing a war, they just left their house with nothing. No. This is an investment into your future. Many people sell their property. It takes money to come to America illegally. $5,000 to $10,000. It's more expensive to come to America illegally than to get on a plane legally, by far. And it's obviously infinitely more dangerous. And the reason that people do this is they're not fleeing wars. I mean, if you're fleeing a war in Central America, you can just move to Mexico. You really can. I mean, I'm being callous here, but let's be very, very realistic. The reason people come to America is because you can find a job and make money illegally. And in many countries in the world, that's actually not possible. In many countries in the world, if you take a job, you have to prove that you have a work permit before the employer is allowed to give you your salary. That's not necessarily the case in America. And if you're caught, employing illegal immigrants, you don't really get punished in the US. I mean, there's ways to punish, but no one really gets punished. This is something that some Republicans are starting to point out. There is this built-in hypocrisy of American capitalism, which is that it requires labor. We all close our eyes. We let the illegal immigrants basically invest 10,000 of their hard-earned money or sell their generational property somewhere in Guatemala to come here. And now, after multiple years of having them work here and make money, we put them in a white van and ship them out. And so I think the purpose is to stop the flow, to reset the system. The problem is I see no attempt by the administration, at least not as of yet, to create a document, a plan, that says, okay, here is what the immigration is going to look like from now. And that's where I think the uncertainty that you talked about of business community is the greatest. I don't think it's trade anymore. The tariffs are what they are. They're probably going to go down. If I was a CEO, I would feel confident on basically projecting from here onwards. It's not going to get worse. It's done. I haven't heard anything from Peter Navarro in the last 6 months. You know what I mean? He's back in the back. It's a lower dungeon of the White House. The question is immigration. Will there actually be comprehensive immigration reform? Because the brutality of enforcement has done its job, if you will. If you're giving President Trump, credit for something, okay, fine, the flow of illegal immigrants has stopped, but American economy cannot survive without some immigration. And it's nice to shift it from illegal to legal, but then you need to shift it to that. And that's where I think is going to have a big problem, because how do you get Democrats and Republicans to put together a comprehensive immigration reform? That's going to be tough.
For sure. And specifically about agriculture, which is so dependent on foreign-born workers. How do they get through this transition, whatever this transition is?
I think this is going to be a huge problem. In a $12 billion bill that they're trying to push through, it ain't going to cut it. I can tell you that. They're going to have to figure out this fast. And there's many examples of this. Canada, for example, has a very, very successful guest worker program for farms. And people go back. People go back. This idea that you just disappear is just not true. Why? Because people who come to America are not fleeing war, pestilence, and rape. They're just not. They're not. And that's the liberal view. We have to accept them because they'll die somewhere. No, they want jobs. And if you make it illegal for them to have a job in America, and if you make it illegal to hire them, like really illegal, then guest worker programs work. People come, they do their job, visa expires, they go back with the money they made. And they apply again for the next seasonal, shift. This actually works in Canada. It works very well in Canada. Canada has a huge agricultural industry as well, just north of where you are. I mean, you just go north, it's the same thing, a little colder though. But the point is that I think it's possible to get there. I just think the problem is that the right and the left in America are so opposed to it. And so the left has now kind of swung towards this idea that without open borders, millions of people will die from prosecution. And so any kind of a work program is just like not enough. In fact, President Trump, I got some sympathy for him. I mean, back in 2017, 2018, I think his administration proposed a point-based system for immigration modeled, honestly, copy-pasted from Canada. And he was accused of being a racist. Well, it's like, Canada's not racist. Canadian immigration program is not racist. But that's what he was accused of when he proposed it. So the left has unrealistic expectations of what immigration is going to look like. And the right internally has a civil war over this. Because for many on the right, illegal immigration is just abhorrent because it's illegal and it's against the law. But then there's others on the right who do make this about race. And so how do you even allow guest worker program? So both sides I think are so far apart that I think it's really up to the Midwest. And I say that because I'm in your podcast. I think it's going to come down to centrist Republicans and Democrats in Midwest farm states to tell both sides, like, y'all are crazy. Here's a solution. And that's it. Who's going to join us? It's going to require Democrats and Republicans from the Midwest, like members of the House, coming together and saying, like, we got to fix this. It's not about ideologies, and it's not about these extreme views. America's going to need workers from outside of the U.S., and other countries have these programs. They work. Let's move on.
That's what fascinates me about the conversation, because how do we get to that point? Do we get to that point because the brutality aspect of this, as you pointed out, that is clearly part of Stephen Miller, the whole concept in a lot of ways about the administration, what they're going out and bombing the Venezuelan suspected drug carrying vessels going wherever they're going in the Caribbean, that sheer force and brutality, grabbing people, and in some cases it's American citizens, and then eventually they get returned, or you take somebody, you take them out of the country, you send them to some random country somewhere else. I mean, there is that sort of inhumane, brutal method that they're trying to do. But does that change when there's almost a pushback from the American people about, okay, that's too much here? Or is there going to be a purge in the midterms in 2026? I'm wondering how we get to the place that you've laid out, which is probably sensible for a lot of folks.
Well, I'm data driven, so I can tell you exactly what I think is going to happen based on data. President Trump is assessed every month by polls, and we can split up his popularity by issue. And so I will unequivocally say no, it won't be the brutality. Out of all the issues out there, President Trump has the highest approval rating effectively on immigration, which actually means that a large proportion of Americans, not a majority, but this is where he has the highest plurality, supports that. So it won't be the brutality. But where he has the lowest support is on handling of inflation. And it's on handling also of trade issues. And that's why I'm telling you, they're going to start adjusting the trade policy towards less brutal. On immigration, I think it's going to be just prices. A lot of workers work on farms, but also a lot of them work in hotels, in the kitchens, in the service economy. And, I think that's where it's going to be. It's going to be on the prices. And voters, I have a lot of hope in voters. They may not get things right in 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, but on a long enough of a timeline, the median voter in America or any other country, this is why democracy like works. Yeah. It works because eventually the median voter gets it. Eventually. Now, sometimes they like to vote themselves some nice checks and so on, and that's not always good, but eventually they're
Sure.
like, ooh, that was a mistake. Look at, for example, in Argentina. Maybe it took Argentina 20 years to realize they need a smaller government, but there they are, like cutting the government with a chainsaw.
Hmm.
So, in the case of the US, I think eventually what's going to happen is that the median voter is going to realize, oh, yeah, we do need like foreign labor. And it doesn't have to be illegal. It doesn't have to be unregulated. And these people can go back, but there needs to be a comprehensive legislation that allows that to happen. And when I say comprehensive legislation, you need the supply of laborers, you need the supply of humans, but you also need to regulate the demand of American economy. And what I mean by that is that you cannot allow business owners to hire illegal immigrants. It will break the whole system. So there needs to be enforcement on both the business owner side and the immigrant side. Once you do that, if you're a human being in America and your visa expires and you cannot find a job, like you're not going to stay here and do what? Like, how are you going to feed yourself and your family? You can go back and apply. Like, yeah. And the more you've worked here, the more times you've come here as a guest worker, the more like you're gonna get that new visa renewed, and that's a path to, I think, a coherent immigration program. It just does require both sides to get there.
So you said you're a data-driven guy. Would the data show you that we are set for a course correction in November 2026?
Yes, but it's going to be because of inflation. So,
Hmm.
first of all, just to be clear, forecasting a sitting president of the United States of America of losing the midterm election is like,
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like, uh,
but there's a
President Trump is
difference
going to.
between a little nibble or a seismic course correction.
Great question. So I think it will be a seismic. Right now, President Trump is tracking. We have various models to like do this. Obviously, they go wrong all the time, so you can ignore me, which is perfectly fine. But it's like about a 40-seat loss in the House, and I think that when that loss happens, and when people look at the data I'm looking at right now on your behalf, I would say that they will take from it not that the brutality of the immigration enforcement had anything to do with it. I think it will be inflation and affordability issues. And I put that in quotes because the two are different and separate.
Hmm.
Inflation is about, month to month, year to year change in prices. So has the price of my iPhone gone up? And there President Trump scores very low. Affordability is more about something like, is it affordable to be middle class in this country?
Hmm.
What's daycare like? What is tertiary education for your kids looking like? How much does like Iowa State cost for a non-Iowan? Like a lot. Costs a lot,
Hmm.
So those things, and finally home prices, obviously. Those are all things put together. And I think that President Trump has focused his attention on three things. Foreign policy, where I would actually give him very high grades, even though a lot of his like peace deals are not working out. He hasn't started wars. He hasn't really wasted any of American, treasure. So he has done like pretty good Machiavellian realist job on that. So foreign policy is something he put a lot of effort into. The problem is that nobody in America really cares about foreign policy. That's kind of the irony. American presidents are pushed to do foreign policy stuff because that's where they have the least constraints from Congress. The problem is Americans almost never vote on foreign policy issues. It's just a paradox. The second issue for President Trump that he focused a lot is immigration. And then the third issue is these tariffs. And so let's take foreign policy aside for a second. On immigration and on tariffs, he obviously has not reduced prices, And so I think he's going to
Despite
get,
the claims.
yeah, of course. I mean, and this is one of those things where I have sympathy for the view from the White House. The CPI increase, the increase of prices from tariffs will be temporary and then will be disinflationary on the 6 to 12 month. I agree with this. Yes, God bless you. But you know what? CPI went up. in that 6 to 12 months. So like you can't sit there and be like, oh, inflation hasn't gone up. It has. It just won't be persistent. I get it because it's a tax.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you then stand as Scott Bessent has a really challenging tax because he has to tell the American people, listen, this inflationary spike is temporary because you'll have less money with which to buy other goods. You see
Which
what I
is a
mean?
tough thing. Yeah, that you can't say that publicly.
You can't, I mean, that's like, oh, thanks. Like, got it. So my point is they're in a bind. They're going to get crushed in the midterms. And what happens then? What happens then?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know on immigration. I think on immigration, course correction would require an ideological alignment between the two parties. And that will require a purge at the White House. A lot of the folks you mentioned will have to lose their job. So that's the number one thing. On the other thing, on trade, I think you will have President Trump again. I think he will course correct ahead of the midterms. I think you'll see more things like bananas go down in price. Oh, you
Mm-hmm.
know what? We decided we have a really good relationship with China now. So here's a controversial forecast for your, listeners. I would say that over the next 12 months, the country that will get most tariff relief will be China. Why? Because we get the most bang for our buck with Chinese goods. And the
Mm-hmm.
truth is, like, are we really improving our national security if we onshore toaster oven production into America? Like I think I look, call me a useful idiot and a sympathizer of the Chinese Communist Party, but I think toaster ovens should be 0% tariff in Walmart. When I walk into Walmart, I think my toaster oven should be $60. I don't know. Like just crazy idea here. EVs may be different thing, but there's a slew of goods that we buy from China that if we continue to buy them for the next 50 years, will not make China a great power. Yes, they generate revenue over this and they can invest in other things. God bless them, we do too. When we send them a Boeing, we get revenue and we invest it into hypercruise missiles. You know what I mean? Like, so the point here is I think that that's where they're also going to course correct ahead of the midterms and after. But here's a negative way to look at it. Course correction for President Trump might not mean what you want it to mean. And that's where that meeting with Mamdani is so interesting, Dave.
Mm-hmm.
Like where I think there's a huge risk for the business community is that he loses these midterms badly because of affordability and inflation issues. And the lesson he takes is not to double down on like pro-market, pro-business, supply side reforms. It's not to like reform and restructure and do painful things, but rather like, you know what? I like the cut of his jib. This young, good-looking guy up in New York City. You know what? He's right. And that's where like when you look at some of President Trump's allies, ideological allies, people who really think about this, like Stephen Bannon. Stephen Bannon is very objective. He's very honest. He's very articulate. And he has said before, like, I think people who make over $1 million in this country should be taxed at a very high rate. So Stephen Bannon and AOC don't really have much disagreement on how to restructure the tax code in the country. And so I think the danger is that you and I are sitting here being like, well, maybe after the midterms, the immigration policy will be more pro-business and coherent. Maybe the tax policy will be more, but actually it becomes the opposite. And when President Trump realigns after the midterms, he doubles down and triples down on populist policies. The opposite of Clinton, the reverse Clinton. Clinton came in 92, Arkansas guy, very populist, wanted to give the peace dividend back to the Americans. He loses the midterms in 94, sits down with Newt Gingrich, and pushes out a lot of pro-market reforms. I think with Trump, it could be actually different. So that's something to watch as well as a risk to the business community.
You may have teed this up well. I was going to ask you to close us out on what fascinates you the most about something you'll be watching in 2026, and you may have teased it a little bit there.
Well, I'm looking at a couple of other things. One is global growth. This is something that, we talked a lot about US today, but a lot of your listeners, I think, care about demand outside of American borders.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a lot of ways, if I was running an agricultural business, I would not necessarily be concerned that we're taxing our consumers more. Like tariffs are not a bad thing. Like President Trump puts a 40% tariff on like Chinese cars, as long as they keep buying soybeans, what do I care? And so, in a way, the tariffs themselves, if they curb domestic consumption, that's okay. That's okay. Most of American farmers don't care just about whether Americans are buying fruits and vegetables and cereals. They care about the whole world. And so, one silver lining for the Midwest is that President Trump is kind of mean to the rest of the world. So let me play this out. What I mean by that is that by being so honestly mean, he has incentivized a lot of other countries to start diversifying from the US, but boosting their economy in the process. So I look at Canada. Canada, for example, building pipelines to China now, saying, okay, cool, we can't rely on Americans. We got to do a lot of other things. In the process of doing that, they do a lot of investment, a lot of capex. They generate more growth, which leads to higher growth levels, higher consumption. President Trump has incentivized the rest of the world to stimulate in many ways because America showed up and is suddenly an asshole. And that's actually good for American exporters. The problem is we don't really see it yet. We saw it in Germany. Germans stimulated the economy massively. The Canadians are doing it as well. We need China kind of to do more. So what I would say to your viewers, what I'm watching the most over the next 6 to 12 months is whether or not the rest of the world offsets American tariffs and American, newfound Machiavellianism with investment of their own. If that happens, there'll be demand for American products no matter what.
All right, so I'm trying to gameplay this. So it's a mixed bag whether this is a longer term benefit or detriment to us. If we are in an industry that's exporting, we're going to do better. If we are more intra-border, we're not.
Well, what I would say is, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the more external demand there is, so I believe that domestic demand in America will have to decline. We have a new consumption tax. Fiscal policy is at an end. The US has basically run like an Argentinian fiscal policy for the past 5 years. We can't blame just Joe Biden on that, by the way. Everybody always like, oh, Joe Biden. Let's not forget 2020. That was Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump hand in hand, just blowing out deficit because of the pandemic. So I think that between the tariffs and the end of this fiscal gravy train, the US domestic demand will have to adjust lower, which is fine. It's fine. It was probably too high to begin with. And that means that the rest of the world will pick up the slack. Now, you might say, well, why would they pick up the slack, Marco? Well, because they have to. Otherwise, they're going to be poorer too. And I think that orienting towards those external markets is the play. And that's where, yes, President Trump's 30% onerous tariffs, the neo-McKinleyist approach, was really bad because it would have led to retaliation. But if it led to negotiations and new deals, it's fine. In fact, what I'm telling you is I would bank on US dollar declining another 20% over the next 5 years. Not forever. This isn't the end of the dollar as a reserve currency. I just think for the next 5 years, the rest of the world will have to stimulate. The US will focus on dealing with its deficits. And that's actually really good for exporters. Dollar goes down, exports are cheaper. But also in all of this, if global demand picks up, as the rest of the world realizes they can't just depend on American gravy train, fiscal gravy train, they can't just depend on Americans spending like drunken sailors, quite frankly. If the rest of the world says, ooh, we need to offset that, I think that will be good for exporters in the US and for a lot of large agricultural businesses. That is the name of the game.
Fascinating conversation. Really appreciate the time and insight, and look forward to hearing you in person in Des Moines in January.
I can't wait. It's going to be fun.
Let's see if the weather cooperates. I hope it
No,
does.
it's okay. I am also Canadian,
yeah,
and so I love it. Let's go.
I love it. Love it. Thank you, Marko. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I always take away so much from these conversations. From Marko, one of the things I will remember when traveling, remember the 3 W's: water, workout, and work. Sounds like a smart plan. Marko will share his experiences in person and his thoughts about where we are headed in the future. He will be a keynote speaker at the Land Investment Expo in Des Moines, Iowa on January 13th, 2026. And I want to remind you that American Farmland Owner is a media sponsor of this annual event. Now, for more about the Land Expo and more about Marko, check out the American Farmland Owner weekly newsletter. It's the place where landowners get their news. You can find it now at AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Thanks for joining us here on the podcast, and thanks for caring about the future of our farmland.